So we are continuing on with hot rod history. We're focusing on the street rods still for this episode, mostly the 80s, the 90s. This is kind of the third wave, maybe, explosion of hot rodding. I mean, this is the era of MTV, you know, showing off ZZ Top.
Right.
You know, you've got kind of hot rodding becoming into the main, you know, culture. We get into the 90s, you know, you start seeing, you know, Boyd cars everywhere.
This is kind of the bright and shiny era.
Yeah, this is the hot rods going mainstream,
right,
if you will, because, you know, for the longest time, even we went back talking in the 40s and the 50s, they were the outlaws. They were, you know, even the Wally Parks and the hot rod guys didn't want to be called hot rodders because of the, you know, the street racing and shenanigans and all that stuff. Right. So this is definitely when it's way more accepted, and, you know, we'll see a lot of these guys start, you know, really expanding, coming out with their wheel lines, like from, you know, Boyd's, but going public, you know, being the first automotive aftermarket company to actually go public on the NASDAQ.
That's right.
And then fail. But basically this is like the hot rodding mainstream time period.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right with that. There's a big change also, because if you ask an old hot rodder what a street rodder is, he'll say someone without horsepower. Right.
Well, that's what's the difference of a street rod and a hot rod? And obviously the more show than go
exactly
kind of took over. But there has been some definitions at this point, because you have, you know, shows like the Street Rod Nationals, Good Guys, you know, starting. So pretty much anything 1948 and older falls under the street rod category.
That's correct.
You know, you want to go hot rod, maybe some guys will go, oh, it's got to be a 34 or a 36 or older, you know, that kind of stuff. But that definitely separates it as well from like the muscle cars or the big body cars, you know, of the eras and the later 50s and stuff like that.
Right. No, correct. That's exactly right.
But what's kind of cool is during this time period too, in the late 70s into the 80s, you started to see some of the hot rod tricks being applied to the muscle cars.
Well, right, because some of the, you know, the older guys were still into traditional hot rods, but the younger baby boomers, you know, they built muscle cars.
Yeah.
You know,
but then they'll maybe take a 73 Camaro but chop the top on it.
Well, now you're talking about a street freak.
And there you go.
Right?
Yeah.
So and the term street freak came from guys doing different body mods, making larger tires fit. You know, sometimes they would have to section out an area of the quarter panel just to get the tire to go in the car. You know, some other guys would even maybe make that smaller so the car looked like it was stuffed. You know, that was
make the back end
look
skinnier, basically, so that the tires look even bigger.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, so that and you know, again, they called them street freaks, street machines. That was kind of the terminology of the time, but the same rules applied. It was make the thing look low, long, more drag looking.
Very funny car
looking
as well.
Right.
So that was kind of like some of the hot rodding tricks of the era that were being applied to other stuff. But then there were still all your guys that were doing the street rods and the hot rods and stuff. You know, we've obviously mentioned Pete Chapouris, you know, heavily in the last episode.
Yeah.
He goes through a few resurgences as well,
right,
you know, during this time period. But
and he was a huge influence still too. I mean, you think about it, like, obviously California Kid, huge influence, Pete and Jakes.
Yeah, but that was 73, 74.
Exactly. But even throughout those years, you know, you've got a guy named Boyd Coddington that works at Disneyland as a machinist, that in 76, 77, he built a center door T, which is those really weird looking phone book looking things, or phone booth looking cars. But, you know, that was like his center door T was a kind of big thing that kind of put him on the map. You know, he had obviously, you know, more influence from Little John Patera, who, like we said last episode, lived around the corner from him.
Yeah.
You know, and they're all in the same hot rod, you know, veins. And John Patera at that time was building funny cars. You know, so he was taking a little bit of the hot rodding from the earlier age, but also a lot of the late model technology that he was learning and applying that.
And that's really what, you know, was a lot of these hot rods were become, you know, high tech hot rods, then later kind of more billet rods.
Right.
But then for a while, like this kind of era of street rods became, even if it wasn't built by Boyd, it was the Boyd hot rod or the Boyd look. But what's interesting is his influence on that was Little John Patera.
Right.
So even though it's called the Boyd look, where everything's much smoother, you know, you don't have crazy, door handles or anything
Yeah.
that's uninterrupted. Everything's designed very cleanly. He learned that from
Little
John.
Terra, right?
Even in Boyd's words himself, he was saying that John taught him, like, anything as you take your eye across the car, anything that interrupts and catches your eye when you're going across it, get rid of it.
Right. That was
So-
the whole front to back and back to front.
Yeah.
If something catches your eye, that means it's got to go. And he's also
Or refine it, or do something.
right.
Yeah.
And his famous words are "less is more."
Yeah.
I mean, that was like his kind of tagline. And if you think about it, though, look, I mean,
way more work going into it, especially when
true.
you're building a body from scratch or something.
right. And like you
But
mentioned
you're,
too,
you're not just adding and throwing a bunch of stuff at
well,
it.
Boyd and Little John being machinists, both of them looked for absolute perfection.
Yeah.
So your door gaps, now all of a sudden when they built a car, every door gap had to line up. It had to be 3/32. It had to actually look like as if the car was made of one piece.
Yeah.
And that I think was, you look at, he wins the AMBR in what, 82 with Jamie Musselman's Roadster.
Yeah.
So, you look at the previous year with the Vern Luce Coupe where he wins the Schloneker with. That car, when it showed up, he was the car that, like, where was the chrome?
Yeah.
Because those cars before were chrome accessories,
Well, it was
lights.
it was
big-
whatever attention you could get,
Right.
basically, to
where
draw
Boyd
someone's
said,
eye.
and Boyd looked at this and goes, nope, I want this to be painted. I don't want a bunch of chrome. I want the wheels to stand out. I want certain items to catch your eye that are, machine made.
Yeah.
But what's funny about Boyd is he was never a horsepower guy. Like, if you kind of look at all of his cars, they're
Well, and
like,
that's-
a stock 350, but with a super lot of refinement on it.
Yeah.
Like, he's the guy that's grinding the block and, like, painting it over to match the outside of the car, where a guy before, like, hey, rattle can, Krylon black, and we're good to go.
But it's got something
But
that's
it's got horsepower.
1,000 horsepower and big old blown BDS,
Yeah.
blower on it.
Right.
No, and that's, even some of the things, like, later on, yes, he had some partnerships with Cadillac to put their newest, like North Star
Right.
engines and stuff in there, which, okay, literally a couple hundred horsepower.
Right.
But newer, modern,
Yeah.
so perfectly drivable, perfectly reliable. And they end up doing several cross-country trips in some of these cars, like Cadzilla
Yeah.
and Shazoom and, the Boydsters and stuff like that.
Right.
So, yeah, you're not going to drive, and this obviously falls into the street rod category for
Right.
sure. You're not going to drive a 1,000 horsepower blown dragster, 1,000 miles.
Right. Well, there you go,
So-
too. Boyd kind of, that was his,
Do you want to go a quarter mile or 1,000 miles?
well, okay, Fat Jack.
Yeah.
Fat Jack, another famous hot rod builder. I mean, he kind of went after the tub cars. He was like into, like,
Yeah.
the 46 Fords and, 40
yeah,
Fords.
the later end of the street rod
right.
years.
But every one of his cars had big horsepower.
Yeah.
And he would take them to the track and actually would run the cars. Now, Boyd was the opposite. Boyd was like, I'm going to drive it to the track.
Yeah.
So-
I'm not even going to go to the track.
Yeah.
I'm going to drive it across the country to a show.
Across the country.
Yeah.
But he had a different clientele. His clientele was that guy that I want to be seen. I want to drive the car. I don't want to trailer the car. I want to do the things with cars. So if you think about it, it's kind of the revitalizing of a touring car.
Well, and that's
in a
the thing
sense.
too. Later on too, Boyd they ventured a lot into the more touring cars and the fancy French cars and
Yes.
Delahaye's and stuff versus hot rods and customs and stuff. So
Right.
yeah, that definitely was the style, the design, the craftsmanship that went into these cars seemed to be the most important for guys like Boyd versus how fast can I go and how light can I make this
Right,
car? No,
right.
it's how cool can I make this car look?
Well, I think Boyd too. I mean, look, we're giving him a lot of credit.
Yeah.
He was surrounded by a ton of very, very
Throughout-
talented people throughout his career.
The entire 4 decades of Boyd's shop.
I mean, you look at it, artists like Kenny Youngblood or even,
Tom Taylor.
Tom Taylor,
you
those
know,
guys
some
were
of those
all
guys.
guys that were helping Boyd with what his vision was. But then he had guys like Bob Bowder, for example, was an amazing fabricator that, he was kind of Boyd's go-to guy to like, okay, we need to get this done. Who's my go-to guy? Bob Bowder. And he was there from the beginning almost all the way up to the end. So, the cars that we're talking about, Vern Luce Coupe, we're talking about Jamie Musselman's Roadsters in the early days, but now let's talk about Shazoom, Cadzilla.
Yeah, no, I mean there's plenty more, but let's kind of jump into the hot rod hysteria that helped to make all of those cars
true.
possible, because you're not, Shazoom, Cadzilla, high dollar cars, high dollar builds, lots of fanfare. You're not going to get that without some money coming in and some popularity. So we mentioned, Pete and Jake's, Pete Chapouris, and we mentioned Cadzilla. Well, there's
something before then. Yeah.
There's a couple ties in there, and and it's called a band ZZ Top.
Exactly.
So Billy Gibbons, obviously everyone knows he's a huge car guy.
Right.
But he said that, his seen California Kid, seen that movie, seen that car in the 70s, when he was a teenager, sparked his interest, and so now when they're starting to get some money. MTV's popping up in the early 80s.
Right.
They're starting to take advantage of that,
Yeah.
To show their style in a visual way, not just, the music.
Right.
So he approaches Pete Chapouris to build a coupe that becomes the Eliminator
The
coupe.
the 33 3-window coupe that you see on the music videos.
Yeah, it was on the cover of their album Eliminator,
right,
in 3 or 4 different music videos.
Oh yeah.
But
I was that kid watching it, and believe
so
me, it
inspired you.
It totally inspired me. Like, I was like, wow, a Hot Wheel is on TV.
There you go. Yeah.
And to me, that was a game changer. I mean, I would wait for that first "Give Me All Your Lovin'" video. I was like, it's on again, and I would run to watch it.
This is not YouTube or anything.
Yeah,
It was
like,
okay,
oh my God, it's on again.
It?
Yeah.
You got to just have it going in the background. You got to wait through Madonna and Michael Jackson to see
little George Michael maybe.
Yeah, maybe that's later, but
later on, whatever.
Yeah, you're getting your 80s mixed up.
This is true. This is true. It's all a blur.
It's hard, yeah. I'm sure it was.
But no, that car, seriously, that was a daily reminder of a hot rod.
Yeah.
And not only that, guys like myself that dreamt about building these cars, I'm like, wow, there's a market for this.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually I can grow up and I can build hot rods for people on TV.
Yeah.
That
you got someone who's famous, a celebrity, a musician who's into this stuff. It's not just your guy around the corner that's into it.
And what I loved about that too was that car was unique. I mean, if you think about it, that car is everything 80s. It's got the linear,
Kenny Youngblood.
Kenny Youngblood did the
ZZ kind of graphics, and
which turned into the
80s.
most famous 80s paint job ever. I mean, I think everything that had linear graphics had some type of ZZ return back in it. But, they did it clearly for ZZ Top.
I'm sure that's knowing there's not, I don't know if there is a definitive yes, this is why we did it, but just going into the artist mindset, 100% that's probably what Kenny was thinking of, is ooh, I'll put a couple Z's in here.
Yeah,
because it's you always want that little accent, you want that little something to pop out at it.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And then you look at Tom Taylor that actually designed the interior.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got two designers that at the time, I mean, they're the Mount Rushmores of aftermarket car design.
He approached Pete Chapouris to build it.
Right.
Pete Chapouris didn't necessarily, it wasn't a Pete and Jake's start to finish car. He basically managed the project and contracted it out. That probably had either something to do with just getting it done on time, because they probably had we got a release date for the album. We've got a music video we need to film. So we're talking about all these hot rods and hot rod shows. The Grand National Roadster Show is one of the most iconic. What's really cool in the last couple of years is they've spun off to create the Grand National Truck Show. This year, September 26th, 27th at Pomona Fairplex. We'll be out there with a booth doing some live podcasts.
Yeah, if you're a truck fan, this is a show you want to go to, because clearly they're going to crown, again, the world's most beautiful truck, the Wombat.
It's open to all year, make, models of trucks. This is not just a classic truck show or a hot rod truck show. C10s, square bodies, we're going to have a couple OBS trucks out there, but even mini trucks. I mean, what was really cool, you had a dancing bed competition there last year for all the mini truck guys. September 26th, 27th. You can get all your tickets at rodshows.com. You can register your truck for inside or the outside drive-in, and you can even get tickets discounted at O'Reilly's.
That's right. Don't forget that. So
and come visit us.
That's it. Yeah, come by, say hi to us. We're going to be doing
podcasts. We're going to have some giveaways.
Yeah.
So come check it out. The Grand National Truck Show, Pomona Fairplex.
We'll sell you the seat, but you'll only need the edge.
Okay. Well, and that's, like you say, you had some of these top designers of the time, and I guess Buffalo Motor Cars is the one who did a majority of the work on the car.
Right.
But you had guys like Steve Davis, well known for doing the grills and did the hood and the sides of the hood, all that.
Right.
So it's kind of like brought together the best of the best at the time.
Yeah.
To work on this car.
And you're right. Pete and Jake's was the premier hot rod shop of the 80s.
Yeah.
Those guys
this is
were
still the early
mainstream.
80s,
right?
When so Boyd's is still on the come up, basically.
Yeah, and Boyd was the car builder. He wasn't the wheel guy yet. He was the car builder. Yeah. Whereas Pete and Jake's, they had already had a full-blown mail order company going, selling and manufacturing
all
parts.
Parts are basically, you're getting suspension or you're doing something. It's probably
from Pete and Jake's, right? Yeah. So I mean, but it was that's good that they utilized that for Pete to manage that project, because obviously, clearly, the Eliminator car, that's what it's called. It's called the Eliminator.
Yeah. Eliminator
the Eliminator Coupe was an amazing car that spawned so many other cars that are, we'll talk about more about that.
No, for sure. But that's, one of the things that really helped catapult a new era of hot rods as well. Like, you had the Boyd stuff and you had stuff going on at shows, but when you're talking mainstream, now it's mainstream again, and also too, this is kind of time period when Happy Days starts to
well, Happy Days was on its it was on its kind of inroad, but that was the whole thing is people they recognized that, right?
You were kind of getting that resurgence a little bit,
right,
and showing it in the mainstream.
Well, because also too, think of this: if we're getting into, like, let's say the year of 85, 86, another thing happens, which is Pro Street, and that kind of I don't want to say it derailed hot rodding, but it changed.
And that's kind of a continuation of what we talked about with the Street Freak, and street machines and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But that's so now your guys are working on a lot of that stuff as well. And it's kind of interesting. So 87, that's when Pete and Jake's is sold.
Correct.
Right.
But also that's the same year that Pete Chapouris builds Limefire.
Yeah. So, but that's, so he basically goes out on his own, and PCG3.
The worst name for a street rod company. That's actually what that stands for.
Yes, that's what PCG3 stands for.
Pete Chapouris Group
3,
which was supposed to be cubed.
Oh, that's what it was?
That's what it was. That's what the 3 stood for, was cubed. So I'm assuming, because Pete has a son, he has a junior.
Okay.
So I'm wondering, actually he has a third. So I'm wondering if that meant like 3 of Pete's together. I'm guessing, not sure. Right. We'll have to, come on, people, tell us.
Yeah. I mean, that would be.
But worst name ever.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Because no one could ever say it. Everyone just ended up saying, like, Pete's shop.
Yeah.
That's what it was referred to, because
so it's no longer Pete and Jake's.
Yeah.
It's just Pete's
shop.
Basically.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but he built Limefire, which, I look back at that car now and it just, ugly is the word that comes. And I know I'll probably get crap for this, but ugly to me is the word that comes out. However, at the time when it came out, future was the word, because it had a different flame paint job, which flames too in the 80s weren't, everyone thinks, flames 80s. Not really. That was linear graphics.
I was going to say, that was all linear graphics, boat graphics. Like which were brought over a lot from the dragsters and stuff like that.
So. No, that was the style at the time, So, and in street machines too, street machines were known for having linear graphics. So when Pete brings back, flames, he brings it back to a classic car that made sense.
Yeah, it's that time period. It's the 30s. Yeah.
Right. But, and I don't know, obviously the California Kid was something that he was into, so I guess Pete really liked flames.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Sometimes these guys just have something they like and they just keep doing it versus trying to figure out a trend or match a trend.
And that was going on too, though. I mean, the Brizios were doing the same thing. Roy Brizio, he was, obviously Andy's son and was.
Yeah, he kind of really took over more. Like Andy started
the
hot rod shop.
The T-shirt business,
kind of went off on his own, and so
because Andy was doing the T-shirts and the picnic, obviously, but Roy kept the shop open,
and
then he was the guy that really started building the cars. And that's where you're going to get, like, a couple different Andy's cars that he would take to all the picnics. And they had also same thing, big, bright, beautiful paint jobs with giant flames that had, I remember they had like the shadowing looked like they were made of stone, kind of like the flames just looked weird. But for the time period, they were such a game changer. So I think that's why those cars got so iconically popular, just because look at the difference. This guy does flames different.
Well, and that it kind of seemed, a little bit that at that time, Pete was kind of looking back a little bit too, so maybe the flames were kind of a little bit of a throwback.
Yeah.
But he also, some of the first cars he started doing after he built that was actually restoring some of the early,
Correct.
40s hot rods.
Right. Well, what better suited person than Pete at the time? I mean, Pete's in his prime and known as kind of the hot rod guy. So, enter Bruce Meyer, who actually purchased the Pearson Brothers coupe and wanted to have that restored. So what better person at the time than to call the ultimate hot rod guy, which is Pete Chapouris.
Mm-hmm.
So
no, and that's, so he restored the Pearson Brothers coupe. That led to then, doing work to restore the SoCal, belly tanker.
Right.
A few other pretty notable, hot rods that now at this point they're 30, 40 years old, and who knows where they've been. A lot of them have been sitting and doing like that. So now it's kind of like, okay, now let's look back a little bit towards the early stuff and kind of revitalize that a little bit.
Well, also thank God for guys like Bruce Meyer, because Bruce Meyer, who made money in real estate, well, actually health food in real estate, he's all of a sudden the guy that can afford to pay somebody like Pete Chapouris to say, look, I want this thing to be immaculate.
Yeah.
And, you're the guy that has the direct connection to Alex Xydias from, Pete actually would hang out at Blair Speed Shop and also at SoCal Speed Shop when they were still all open. Well, Blair's never closed, but when Alex still had SoCal Speed Shop, Pete was a regular there. So he had all of the cheat codes, if you will.
Yeah, he knew what to do with it.
Right. And then Bruce Meyer had the money to do it. So, thank God for that, because I think that if that didn't happen, those cars would have been forgotten about. For guys like Bruce Meyer, who ends up forming the Peterson Museum with Robert Peterson. So I think without that right there alone, like we would have lost a lot of history.
No, for sure.
And Bruce has stuff. I mean,
well, and that's, he's got obviously a whole gallery at the Peterson, and he's got some Rodeo Drive, undisclosed location collections of cars.
Yeah.
Like the most expensive hot rod real estate you could think of.
He really does. And the nicest guy in the world too. And also a land speed racer. I mean, he's a record holder himself. So he's not just some rich guy that I want a bunch of trophies. Right. No, this guy has the original stuff. So thank God for that. But that was also the time that some of those baby boomers wanted to look at like what was important to them as little kids. So why not grab onto that? And they would go to guys like Boyd, or they'd go to Pete and say, I want this built. They wanted cars commissioned. Whereas, before, most hot rodders were like, this is my ride. I'm going to build it, and I'm going to go and cruise the boulevard to be the coolest guy on the boulevard. Right? So now these stockbrokers, they show up and they're like, I want that. I want a piece of that.
Yeah, they have the money.
Right.
They want, the look and they want the style. And that's, a lot of the things that then you started to see from Boyd was kind of matching that a little bit. Not to put down any of them, but they were like, they just started cranking them out.
It's true.
He built the machine because that's at this time you've got, the billet wheel has become a business.
Exactly.
So now you can order, and that's basically I think what a lot of their marketing was. Okay, we have a guy willing to pay X number of dollars to have this car built.
Right. We
can use that money in this time to obviously we've got to make a unique car. Do one-off wheels. Well, then let's take that wheel and create a version that can be sold to the whole public.
Absolutely.
To put on a truck, put on a Volkswagen, car, whatever it is.
Right.
The billet wheel industry really jumped up and kind of helped to get the machine running for the hot rod shop as well, to be able to just month after month, year after year, just knock some of these, and pretty wild creations out.
And Boyd set the bar, because when he won, obviously with Jamie Musselman's, that opened up the floodgates for him to build cars for many different people. And it also influenced other builders, like we're forgetting about Ken Posey, who is a guy that's back in Pennsylvania, Dave Perowitz, who was a famous painter and did a lot of bikes, but also he did hot rods. Yeah. So you had those guys that they were also trying to get the Boyd look because they knew that was popular.
Yeah.
Right?
That's what the people were wanting.
That's what the people were wanting. But those guys did excellent renditions of the Boyd look in their own cars, in their own style. I mean, like I mentioned, Ken Posey is like one of the guys that not only built a bunch of different cars, but he made a bunch of parts. Jerry Kugel, same guy. Like Jerry Kugel was a land speed guy, loved to go fast, loved to do all this other stuff, but he was also a machinist. So he's the guy that refined the Jag rear end. So you look at like, Boyd's cars and you'll see this beautiful billet, Jag rear end built by Jerry Kugel.
Yeah.
So there was kind of I guess I want to say like a grocery store where guys walked up, I'll take a little of this, I'll take a little of that, I'll put this together. Here's my combination.
Yeah. And that's kind of what happens when certain things get popular, companies start getting involved. I mean, we saw that obviously with the speed shops and the speed parts companies where, okay, now I can mail order and piece puzzle together my engine package.
Yeah.
Now we're doing that with wheels, suspension, you know, I mean, yeah, you had that with Pete and Jake's, let's say, but even more so, you know, and then all your accessories, like your billet mirrors, that was the first accessory that they made to sell. Boyd and Little John was a mirror.
It was a mirror, right?
You know,
yeah.
Obviously, super small, super easy to,
and anybody can buy it.
Anyone can buy it,
right? And those were the old
valve covers.
I remember those mirrors. They're all the suction cups.
Oh, really?
It had a suction cup to hold it on with just a little piece of billet. And you know, obviously, all of us like, well, it's gonna fall off, you know. But the thing about it was like, you know, some of the guys that I was around, hanging around, the older guys, they were into Volkswagens, and they utilized those as, oh, I got a cool California look mirror that, you know, goes on a Roadster, but would look cool in a Volkswagen. So that also spilled over into other builds as well. You know, and we started to see how billet parts spilled over into truck, you know, mini trucks and other, you know, full size trucks.
Obviously the sport trucks,
right?
You know, little in the later '80s and stuff. And Boyd had a huge, you know, part to do with that, and they were just cranking those out as well. And the same exact style, like get rid of the bumpers, clean up the door handles, you know, all the hot rod tricks.
Yeah.
The hot rod style or the billet parts, like some of that stuff was spilling, you know, into stuff that wasn't a hot rod,
right? You
know, more of a custom stuff like that. So, you know, when we bring up, to me, one of my favorite cars of all time, probably yours as well, or at least one of the most
top 5
icon. Yeah. That'd be the Cadzilla,
of course,
you know, owned by Billy Gibbons again,
right?
ZZ Top. And his idea on this was to commission to basically reflect their sound in the later 80s versus the hot rod early 80s.
Right.
It being a little more bluesy, a little more classic, you know, 50s kind of style with some modern, you know, touches on it.
Yeah.
But so obviously a perfect, you know.
It's right up Billy's alley because
old school Cadillac.
Yeah. I mean, think about it. Billy's a blues player, and every blues player sings about a Cadillac.
Yeah. I mean, that's what.
Yeah.
What you aspired to have,
right?
When you're a young poor blues player.
So why not have the coolest Cadillac ever built?
Yeah,
you know, and if you think about it too, you know, Boyd also, now we're getting into coach building. We're sure he's taken some body of a Cadillac. You know, that's a 52, I believe. But at the same time too, they're kind of doing this and starting over.
Yeah.
You know, and that's Larry Erickson that comes in. And Larry Erickson, if you guys don't know who that guy is, he's a GM designer. So this guy's designing cars for General Motors, but he decides, well, I'll take a crack at an old Cadillac. So now you're getting bucks up builds, and you're getting coach build, you know, type things, and you're having again too more people. Like again, we're going to talk about Bob Bowder being involved with it, Craig Neff being involved with it. You know, God, who else was the guy that did? Well, Craig did a lot of the metal work.
Yeah. Well, and then you had Ron Magnus down the interior.
Down the interior there.
Know,
that's right.
That.
Yeah, so
did a lot of the street rod interiors of that time period,
right?
And
so now
set a style for that.
Well, we're starting to hear all these names that we're accustomed to hearing now. I mean, now those are like kind of household names, but at that time, these guys were like, "Who are these guys?"
Yeah,
and,
they were kind of some of the younger
you guys are building this thing out of where?
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't like there wasn't a big car studio where you had the guys that are doing clay moldings. This was like they literally were getting out sheets of paper and doing life size.
But they're doing a life size rendering of a large Cadillac.
right. You know,
so it took up a whole room.
Right.
But, and that's what's really cool too, is kind of seeing some of this and talking with Larry, talking with, you know, Boyd's son, Chris, and some of the other guys.
Well, hell, even Randy.
Bob Bowder and stuff. And
let's talk about Randy Lorenzen on this.
That photograph.
I mean, just him photographing that for Hot Rod, and you know, Jeff Smith too, Jeff Smith putting his job on the line to put a black car on the cover of Hot Rod.
A black Cadillac on the cover of.
Would made no sense at all, but Jeff pushed for it, and you know, Randy did an amazing job, which, you know, we'll share the little Easter egg of that. Is the backdrop of that is an actual set painting
from Spaceballs.
For Spaceballs.
Yeah.
Right?
the underground tunnel that is in the background of the poster and the magazine cover is from Spaceballs.
Yeah.
And then I believe the bench they grabbed off the street.
They did. Right. Yeah.
And then he basically threw whatever random stuff they could into, you know, the set just to
but it worked.
kind of mix it up a little bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, you had a pretty iconic poster that came out of that from ZZ Top. They toured it around as well with their concerts and all that stuff.
And it did well for Hot Rod Magazine as well.
Yeah.
I mean, it introduced another generation to Hot Rod Magazine. Because again, too, I'm in high school this time, and all of a sudden now it's like, whoa, what's that magazine at the library? Whoa, I'll look at that.
Yeah, maybe you weren't into the street freaks and the pro street and big crazy muscle car stuff, but you're like, oh, this.
Yeah, that was different. That was pretty cool. So the other thing that's really neat about this car too is that it sets up, basically Boyd had a hold my beer moment, because Joe Hodaka, who owned Mr. Gasket at the time, he commissioned Boyd afterwards to build Shazoom. And if you kind of look at the roof line of the Shazoom, like you kind of think, oh, it's just like, ZZ, or it just looks like Cadzilla. The funny thing about it is the roof is actually off of a 70 Cuda.
Really?
Yeah.
On a 57 Bel Air.
Yeah.
Basically.
So they chopped the top of a 70 Cuda and they made that fit onto that proportion. And again, that's a Kenny Youngblood thing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously he did the rendering for it. But yeah, that's how they figured that out. The other thing, too, if you notice on that car, is the first time they used flush-mounted glass on a hot rod.
Oh, yeah. That's right.
Yep. So, I mean, there's a lot of firsts on those cars, too. And the thing I think is real funny is Shazoom was one of those cars you loved it or you hated it. Mm-hmm. A lot of people were like, you destroyed a classic. Oh, how can you do that?
Yeah, the Tri-5, Chevy Bel Airs, like, it was tough to go. Yes, you still had that giant fin. They still had that, but it was definitely refined, and you use machine trim versus the old chrome and stuff. But if you took that fin away, it would probably it doesn't look anything like the Tri-5 Bel Air.
Well, and that was the nice thing. Again, we're going back to old hot rodder tricks where they're cutting and pasting things. They sectioned that car, but the fins are still the same height. Right. So, and then the roof line brings it down. It makes the car look smaller. Yeah. It actually makes the car even look shorter, but the car's honestly not. There's a lot of like little hidden Easter eggs of metal work on just how that car is put together. And again, too, talking to Chris Coddington, he said that, he remembers driving in that car with his dad on hot rod power tours, stuff like that. Yeah. And he said it was a great driving car, but horrible blind spots, which would make sense. It's a chopped car. I mean, you're not turning over your shoulder to look. Yeah.
Yeah. They didn't design it.
No, it's designed to look cool standing still. Yeah. So, but that was a big car at the time too, because that was another industry guy that commissioned a car. It wasn't just Joe Hodaka like, oh, look I built this car. It was like, no, I had somebody build this car for me. Yeah.
No, and they use that a lot. Obviously, same with, a lot of the other cars, even the Eliminator Coupe, and there's always a model car version.
That's true.
Kit built of these.
Right.
And that was used a lot in their advertising. But it kind of seemed, so that was like 89, 90, 91.
Yeah.
Like they were obviously, we mentioned, back to back, coming out with stuff. Kind of seemed like in the early 90s went back a little bit. They were still focusing on the hot rods, but there's a few creations that came out of Boyd's shop that were more of your early hot rods versus like, the the Cadzilla or Shazoom that are, I would put in the custom category.
Exactly. Yeah. It's not really a hot rod because it's not a coupe. It's not it's not an early 30s car. Yeah. You're going to have to say that I would think Chip Foose's influence is where that comes from, because Chip graduates Art Center, I think in 89.
Yeah.
Gets a job immediately from Boyd. But I mean, look at Chip. He grew up with his dad, Sam Foose, that had been building tub cars, for many years.
Yeah,
so he had that.
He was
influence.
a known hot rod builder and stuff. Yeah,
and also, you look at what Chip was thinking in his head too. I mean, he's designing the hemisphere in his head at this time, right?
Which later became
the Prowler,
the Plymouth Prowler. Yeah, but that's basically a very modernized, streamlined 30, for coupe basically.
But Chip designs the Boydster. That was, I think, the first thing that they designed out of that after Shazoom.
Well, I think we did look up just to see what the first Foose Boyd car was, and there's the Eldorad Cadillac. So, but I mean, maybe that was, like I said, that was coming off of Cadzilla's success. So maybe it was like, hey, hey kid, take a crack at a Cadillac.
Right.
All right, maybe this Cadillac's not your thing, so let's work on some hot rods together.
But what I liked about the Smoothster was it was exactly what Boyd set out to do. Less is more. Mm-hmm. I'm going to build my version of what a coupe should look, or what a roadster should look like, And I think what a lot of people miss on that car is like the first thing that was the major advancement is that it didn't have a cowl.
Yeah.
So now you have this one piece long hood that your eye doesn't stop. And then
it just goes right up to the windshield.
It just goes right up to the windshield and goes right over it. Right from the sideline. You look at the sideline; it's got a long bonnet or a long, roof. I'm sorry, I can't even talk. It's got a long hood line. So it makes the car look longer, which makes the car look lower. You look at the rear of it and the way it's bobbed enough that you can still see, like, it's almost like someone lifting up their dress, but you can still see what's underneath it, but it's still enough that gives the car that finished look.
Yeah.
Right. So there was a lot of stuff that I think that, again, Chip was fresh eyes, had the information, but had the foresight to look at the future.
Yeah. And I think also too, coming fresh out of, Pasadena Art Center, which kind of turns out most all
if you're somebody,
automotive designers, for whether it's for the big three and,
right.
Detroit and stuff like that, or just custom guys. He probably had some of those technical knowledge and tricks that come from education.
Yes.
Versus just figuring it out on your own and doing stuff.
Yeah.
That he could apply to it and was probably in that mindset a little bit. So like, we pulled up some pictures looking at like the grill shell,
matches exactly the headlight ring.
So the headlight ring and the line of the grill shell match perfectly.
Right.
And the thickness is the same.
Yep. So nothing takes away from your eye.
And so it just flows right into each other.
Yeah.
And then that met up to the body line, perfectly. So it's like every little area was just fine tuned and dialed in, perfectly. And that, you look at that, you look at the, Musselman's Roadster, like there's similarities on everything.
There are, yeah.
It's still, an old, 32.
Yeah.
But there's definitely some like, okay, this is the stamp, this is the model for going forward with a lot of the Boyd stuff.
The other good thing about that car is that it spawned also the Boydster 2 and the Boydster 3, but more importantly is when he won America's Most Beautiful Roadster again, that was the first time he had won it since Jamie Musselman's car. That also, Boyd was already in that mindset of manufacture. Because like you said, the wheel company was flying off the shelves. Matter of fact, even during that time, they had gone public and it failed, but still.
But they were the first, we mentioned earlier, they were the first aftermarket automotive company to go, public filing on the stock market.
Right, exactly. So during that time, yes, he had to reinvent himself in the wheel business, but the car business, he was still doing great. And his idea for the Boydsters was that he wanted to basically create the same thing that your replica Cobras are, where you could buy
it was doing the kit cars.
Right.
It was, okay, the kit car stuff was popular in the 60s and stuff like that. Okay, now let's start doing kit cars.
Why not, right? And I mean, it makes total sense. And anybody that would want a hot rod, and I mean, it was a good looking car.
And also too, I mean, you can sell 1,000 sets of wheels.
Right.
You can't build 1,000 cars.
No way.
But people wanted.
Yes, they did.
Those Boyd cars.
Right.
So okay, now we can supply it, and you can build it.
Right.
Or go to your local shop, and they can build it for you.
Yeah.
And it'll look the same, but and if you ask Chris about this, just because it is a Boyd body,
right,
Boyd wheels, maybe even a Boyd chassis,
right,
does not equal Boyd built.
Right. I know. That's a big thing. People love that though. But I honestly, I love the fact that people want to still put Boyd's name on their car, because he was that much of an influence, And I mean, I know, he's been gone for over a decade, and people have their opinions about him, like him, hate him, whatever. But honestly, Boyd changed our world.
Yeah.
That his influence is still here today, and even I think getting more stronger. I think people are looking nostalgic back and looking at like, man, I totally want to do that.
Because now the 80s stuff, the 90s.
But let's not stop with some of the cars, because in like a short period, I mean like 4 or 5 years, they not only knocked out 3 Boydsters, but in comes the Smoothster, which was something totally out of left field because it was based off of a 37 Ford Cabriolet.
Yeah, so not your traditional,
not a deuce, not a coupe. 37s were bigger cars, but they were still small. Like when we say big car,
compared to
but it wasn't a 40 Ford. Even 40 Fords are bigger than a 37. But what Boyd did is, again, he went to Chip and said, make it proportional. And if you look at those cars, it's exactly what they're called: smooth from the front, smooth all the way to the back. And I mean, the most famous one obviously is that yellow one that we have all seen,
Yeah.
tons of times, and that was the
But
original
then from
Smooster,
that
but
made
another kit car.
cars, and those became very popular.
Oh, very popular.
I'd probably say even more so than like some of your earlier
Yes.
kit cars or your Boydster cars.
Right.
And I think too that swoopy style probably lends a lot more towards, a fiberglass body or
It does.
a custom body, because that's a lot more work.
Yeah.
And metal work to get to that stage of it versus a high boy or something like that.
Right.
So.
Well, and Boyd was utilizing not only his own shop guys, but in comes the delays too. Where this is kind of the time where they start working together, and obviously Marcel and his two sons, Luke and it's gonna kill me now because I always talk to Luke saying like, your dad's got the greatest name in the world.
Yeah.
But God, I forget his other son's name. But anyways, those guys, they're now starting to get commissioned to work on Boyd projects, not just the guys in
fully
shop.
crafting fully bodies and
this
stuff.
again is that coach built deal where we're not just pulling a fender off of this and welding onto that one. We're building the fender
or cutting up the fender.
Yeah,
And
right.
we're starting from scratch.
Yeah.
So we're just going off the designer.
Right.
And throughout the 90s, Foose was the in-house designer. Yes,
Right.
he probably still worked with a couple other guys, but for the most part in the 90s, Foose was the in-house Boyd designer.
And also the 90s gave us enough tools. Now we're looking at CNC equipment.
Computer
right.
controlled machining.
Exactly. Yeah. And that also made the car level go up. Now, like I mentioned before, like when Little John and Boyd were building cars in the early 80s, late 70s, they're trying to make them perfect because they're machinists. Now they're able to say, that is perfect. I made it absolutely to spec. Mm-hmm. And that came from also, all the information they gained from building the wheels as well. And then, not to also say this, but Mike Curtis is a young kid that's hanging around Greg Coddington and gets a job to be a machinist because his buddy's dad has a place to work at a hot rod shop.
Yeah.
So you look at someone who's a Gen X guy who's now getting into hot rodding, but on such a high level. And that's why today you still look at Mike Curtis designs and his machine work, and he's one of the best wheel makers in the business.
Mm-hmm. No, and that's for sure. I mean, we've joked kind of a little bit out of the Boyd University of just so much of the talent that went through there, and that's it. He allowed to have such a large operation to teach and employ a lot of these guys that then went on their own.
Yeah.
To have their own shops and their own creations, but there's always a flip. When a certain style and a certain look becomes the most popular,
right?
There's always guys that either can't afford, probably a combination, can't afford it, don't want it,
right?
Don't like it, want to do something different.
That's right.
And a lot of times that's then looking back at, what was done before, and maybe bringing some of that stuff back. So we mentioned we're getting, in the 90s, the mid 90s, Pete Chapouris pops up.
Once again. Yeah, here he is.
So three decades in, pops up once again. But that's when in 97, he's inducted to the Hot Rod Hall of Fame.
Correct.
And he's had obviously the friendship with Alex Xydias. So in 97, they decide to bring back, or basically they just rename PCG3.
Worst name of shop ever. Yeah.
So good idea.
Yeah.
SoCal Speed Shop. So they basically bring back all the SoCal Speed Shop styling, merchandising, lineage, and that history, and revitalize the, basically almost an original hot rod brand.
To me, it was a breath of fresh air, because for a while, like you said, things got a little over-billetized.
Well, and that's the thing. You get, you're just now Boyd and them basically just cranking stuff out.
Yeah.
So then, and now when, hot rod's about being unique, being different, putting your own personal touch on it.
Right.
So now when your neighbor and 30 other guys across the country can buy the same exact designed body.
Right.
And are picking from a dozen sets of wheels.
Yeah.
And a dozen colors.
Right.
It's now like, oh, this one's blue with those wheels and that one's red with those wheels.
Yeah.
So then it does become a little bit watered down.
Right. No, absolutely.
So you need that breath of fresh air and new look or something different to kind of plug into that, and that also happened, I think, when Chip then went off on his own, around the same time period.
Yeah.
And this was right after we mentioned Boyd going public and then it not working out.
Right.
So they had to file, bankruptcy, restructure the companies. Well, Chip used that as obviously
his exit strategy. Yeah.
And then talking to Chip, it wasn't necessarily an exit strategy. It was oh shit, what am I going to do? Because they didn't know what was going to happen necessarily. Like, yeah, Boyd came back, then had the TV show, like started, almost you could say bigger than ever.
Right.
But you didn't know that at the time. You were like, okay, well, I need a job. Well, I'll just do it myself. And he pulled a couple customers, some guys, and started kind of, working that out.
Yeah.
But then the same thing at SoCal Speed Shop. Then
that's totally what happened.
They had to hire some younger guys as well to get that up and running.
Well,
again.
one of their first employees was Jimmy Shine.
Yeah.
So you look at him, and he's at that time a young kid that's trying to get into this hot rod world, and he knows what's going on. I mean, he's an enthusiast about it.
Yeah.
And of course, he becomes friends with Pete Chapouris, and Pete sees the talent in him and brought him in as his protege.
Yeah.
And here's a funny thing. I got a job at Sir Michael's in 1997, and one of my first meetings where I had to go out and actually like do some outside sales, I had to go visit a couple different shops. One of them was Chip Foose's shop.
So this would have been right when he was starting.
This is right when he started. And he was on Cadzilla in Orange, where Orange at the time in the 90s, 80s and 90s, that was kind of like the hot rod mecca.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
and there's still a lot of hot rod shops, car shops around there, but definitely.
But Chip was in a 1,000 square foot, I remember it didn't even have a man door. It had just only a roll. It looked like a storage facility, and it was next to a car wash. And he had like a one door bay. And I remember bringing him a roll pan, and he's like, "Oh, thank you so much." And I'm like, "Yeah." I'm like, "So is this your storage place?" He's like, "No, this is me." And I was blown away.
Well, because you went to Boyd's and stuff like that.
Yeah,
and you went around there, so you probably knew him or recognized him.
No, exactly.
Him
No,
at
I totally
least.
did. And that's it was such a weird transformation because I knew him as like Chip over at Boyd's, where he had his own office and had all this other stuff, and he was kind of like
all the resources in the world,
right?
More or less, yeah.
And then all of a sudden, he's this one guy.
Yeah. And
it blew me away, and I kind of I felt sorry for him at first, but then I was thinking, well, he's pretty smart.
Yeah, he'll figure
right?
it out.
Yeah,
and
look,
I think he did.
Yeah, I think he did. Right. But I got to give it to him. Talent on talent on talent.
Yeah.
And thank God for another thing too. He's another guy that changed the way that we look at things now. The other thing, we've been talking a lot about West Coast guys, but there were a lot of other things happening in the country that, yes, they were influenced by the West Coast, but they put their own spin on it.
Yeah.
And also too, there's a lot of younger guys that are starting to show up here too. One guy that comes to mind for me is Troy Trepanier.
Yeah.
Where, he's
Midwest Illinois kid.
Exactly. And he's first car he built was his grandfather's Chevelle. Mm-hmm. And, he kind of had more of the street machine influence at the time because that was super popular. And also Pro Street was super popular.
Yeah.
But, what I really enjoyed about Troy was he used what he could.
Well, and he was taking some of he was looking at what the Pro Street and street machine guys were doing.
Right.
Doing some stuff like that. But then a lot of the styling maybe was kind of what Boyd was doing. So that, monochromatic look. And what's really cool, I like this story, is that he said, yeah, I couldn't afford to chrome the whole front end of that.
It's a 66 Chevelle.
The Chevelle, but then what was the Buick? Buick.
Yeah. There was no way he was going to pay for it. Right.
Yeah. That the giant grill and bumper, that's all painted color matched.
Right.
It's like, I'm not going to pay to have all this chromed.
Right.
But that then brought some of the, hot rod Boyd style to the muscle car world.
Right.
Which then kind of and helped start up Troy's, kind of career, like a little bit. I obviously I put Troy in, on a contemporary level, but Troy's a little bit later, and gets recognition a little bit, after Foose and stuff.
Well, I think Troy, you look at the first couple cars he built; those were his. You look at like his '66 Chevelle, that was his.
Impala.
The Impala. Well, that's a little bit later, but all of that stuff too those were his cars.
Yeah.
You look at Sniper, which we're jumping a little ahead of the the deal here. That's kind of the later '90s. But Sniper was the first car that he was like really commissioned to build. Yeah. And that car is beautiful. Chicane, again, that was for Glenn for Billet Specialties.
Biscayne.
It's a Biscayne, right?
Like an Impala.
But what
muscle
people
car, if you will.
What people forget is the reason why he built Chicane is because his dad had a Biscayne called Bisquick. And it was the same thing. It was a 63. Yeah, they were both 63s. And Bisquick had a 540 in it, I believe. So big block power, long car, made to go on the hot rod power tour. because people forget too that events like that. I mean, all of a sudden now people want to drive their cars.
Yeah.
They want to go on long haul races.
Well, and that's, we mentioned that with
rallies.
a lot of the Boyd stuff of doing those, driving to good guys shows in the Midwest and stuff like that. And the Power Tour,
right?
You know, they've had West Coast, they have, you know, and now it's primarily definitely a Midwest thing.
Exactly, right. I think
so
that's where you have the most fun. So, you know, but those events were happening. So, you know, Troy was building cars for that, and clearly, then, you know, he got recognition from, you know, showing up at those events. So people are like, "I want you to build a car." Yeah. You know, so that I think that's where Troy's career kind of took off. Now, Troy being the person that he is, talented at everything. You know, you look at what he does now, and I mean, they make parts. They don't start again. These guys, they make everything. You know, his latest car that, you know, he just won the AMBR with, half of that car was all hand built from their shop. Yeah. So it's just
always
evolution.
it cycles back. Yeah, right. It evolves and cycles back where, okay, now if everybody can build a hot rod, I want to build something that's different. Right. Well, or maybe, you know,
that being the case too is look at Bobby Alloway, how, you know, he's a service writer at a freaking car dealership, right? But you would never guess that because you look at the perfection that he does with his paintwork and everything that's done on those cars. They're beautiful. Now, Bobby was kind of more of the earlier hot rod guy. He wanted horsepower in a car, but he wanted to be known for something. So you look at, like, you know, his car that kind of looks like a Smoothster as well. I'm sorry, a Boydster. The long, drawn-out flames. It makes the car look longer and lower. It gives you that kind of different visual, you know, trick on your eyes. That's Bobby Alloway genius. That's just having the taste to do it that well. And I think that he kind of took a lot of it of what was going on with Pro Street at the time too, and tried to apply that to hot rods, and pulled it off, right? You know, Dan Webb. Dan Webb's another guy that he was a Midwesterner as well, and kind of known for traditional stuff. I mean, he literally built a replica of Barney Oldfield's Golden Submarine, but he was also a hot rod builder. So he was known for building a bunch of, you know, different cars. I mean, he even too, he put hot rod style on a Ford Ranger, which was
and that,
you know, amazing.
Started to become very popular. I mean, we mentioned the hot rod stuff being applied to muscle cars, being applied to things, but like I distinctly remember late 90s, early 2000s of like hot rod styling on everything. Yeah. I mean, obviously we know that, you know, the big three in Detroit then saw this as well. And they started going, oh, you like HHRs? Yeah. You like the Prowler from Chip Foose?
You want a PT Cruiser?
You want a PT Cruiser? Yeah. Yeah. That, you know, looks like a Fat Jack car.
It totally does.
But
not. Not. Right.
But that was the whole point of like, okay, this hot rod stuff is huge and popular. Yeah. Let's do that. Right. You know, but so of course that means too, when you got builders being commissioned to build these high dollar cars, you've got all these parts being made one off. You got bodies that are fiberglass or being made one off by, you know, Marcel and, you know, by the delays and stuff. And Craig Neff, I mean, some of those metal guys were
amazing.
I mean, you're not getting the Boyd look without, you know, people talk about the painters or, you know, the guys making the wheels or the designer, but without the metal work to actually make what Chip drew reality, you're not having it. But you're going to get a younger generation that can't afford any of this stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, and that's also what kind of happened in this time period of the late 90s.
That's right.
In the hot rod world, you know, I'd say versus more of the street rod, and that became a thing because it would be like, oh, it's got to have a street rod interior. Yeah. But it's a Chevy truck. Right. Or it's a Mercedes or something, but it's got a street rod style interior.
Well, I think that, and you're right, I think street rod kind of, if for another term, you would say clean. I want it to look clean. I want it to look like a street rod. Yeah. Whereas, you know, some guys are like, oh, I threw this thing together and it's fast. That's a hot rod. Yeah. And I think that applied to every other build. I mean, I had my Volkswagens. I had a couple fast Volkswagens. I also had a couple nice Volkswagens. Yeah. You know, so that's where I think people kind of drew that line.
That's kind of that definition of the show versus the go fast and have fun of it. But, you know, so we mentioned SoCal Speed Shop coming back. You mentioned Bobby Alloway that really looked a little bit more towards some traditional stuff than what, you know, maybe Boyd or Foose, you know, were doing. But yeah, we started to see at this time period the anti-billet There's even, shows that were
Called that. Yeah.
billet proof, where
Yeah.
if you had billet on your car or you had wheels that were larger than a, maybe, I don't know, 15 or 17, whatever it was,
Right.
you weren't going.
Nope.
So that real traditional stuff really started to come back into play. And of course that, like any trend, that gets blown out and kind of overdone, and we get, rat rods and that kind of, you start to get a little bit of the rebel kind of look and feel with the hot rods again, but going against their own.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's basically traditional or rat rod guys versus high-end, high-dollar street rodders.
You're right. That's
So it's kind of like now an internal division within hot rods.
I think there was a line in the sand. I think there was which side of the sand are you on, or the line you're on? Are you on the street rod, billet rod, high dollar, or are you on the traditional low buck, let's throw something together?
Well, and, that's kind of the thing. Like we looked at, I don't think we mentioned the Illuma Coupe.
That's true.
From Boyd.
Oh, yeah.
Beautiful car.
Sure.
Super nice car. It had a Mitsubishi engine in it.
Right.
At that point, they could care less about tradition.
Right.
They could care less about huge power.
Yeah.
It's just, hey, this is something
This is
different,
a design.
unique, and this is what we have, and it fits in what we want to put in there, and it'll drive it around.
Right. And
that's all we're worried about.
And I don't want to discount that car, because that car is pretty amazing.
No, it is.
Right.
But I'm just saying, but just compared to a guy that has the mindset that a hot rod should have a flat head,
right,
or
small block,
or
whatever.
small,
yeah.
At minimum, I mean, small block Chevy wasn't even until the 50s, so
right,
it's got to either have a flat head in it, it's got to have a built out, Lincoln or Cadillac motor,
right,
or maybe a Chevy small block.
Yeah.
Whereas, the Illuma Coupe, it's got a Mitsubishi motor in it, so we don't even care about the rules of hot rodding at that point. And then you're going to get guys that do.
Yeah. And thank God for that. No,
it always has to cycle around, and we got some really cool cars and really cool builders, I think, that then came from doing more of the traditional style later on.
And I think we should probably save that for the next episode, because there's a lot of cool people and a lot of good names that we're going to mention.
Well, and I think a lot of that is the people that are the top hot rod builders now. Most of them got their start being the traditional guys that were kind of didn't want the fancy paint, didn't want the billet wheels, didn't want, the fiberglass kit cars and stuff like that. They wanted the original, true, real deal stuff and real deal techniques.
Back to the Jenny.